just to talk about Maliki and Maliki Yawmiddin, in the recitation of Abu Amr, the pronunciation is also different. So it's Milki Yawmiddin or Malki Yawmiddin. So you have pronunciation and words. Another example of word changes could be something like, this is where Hafs is very different, the 195% of the world reciting, in the context of Riyaha Bushra, right? In Hafs, or the recitation of Asim, it's Bushra, the word is Bushra, whereas all the rest of the six, they use the root Nashara instead of Bashara. So, and that's a difference between whether you're saying to bring forth clouds or to bring forth glad tidings. So that's an example of word differences.
Welcome back to another episode of the Markfield Institute podcast. Today we have with us our very own Dr. Redhwan Karim. Dr. Redhwan is a BA course leader in Islamic Studies as well as a lecturer in Islamic Studies. He's recently published an edited volume on the history of the Qur'an. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. I mean, it's good to be on the other side of the table for a change. So,
okay, Redhwan, so you've got this new book out entitled History of the Qur'an, Approaches and Explorations. What got you interested in this topic?
Yeah, so I think for me personally, the Qur'an has always been a very focal point in my life, both personally and professionally, as in academically. I was very fortunate to have memorized the Qur'an, and so I've always been engaged with the Qur'an in a more traditional sense. And I spent 7 years also studying traditionally, and spent some time abroad in Egypt and Jordan and things like this. So from that side, I'd always been involved with the Qur'an. But then my academic studies, with my BA, MA, and then even my PhD, there was a huge focus on the Qur'an. My doctorate was a study of the Qur'an. So I've always been interested in the Qur'an and questions surrounding the Qur'an.
Okay, so the book itself covers many different areas, and we're going to get into that throughout the interview. But if you could give us, I mean, the book really focuses on providing an overview of the Qur'an's history. So what are the key stages in that history? Can you provide us with an overview of the Qur'an's history?
Yeah, so if I were to kind of pinpoint specific points in history in terms of the Qur'an's codification, or in terms of the way we have the Qur'an now in the modern period, I'd probably, very broadly speaking, divide it into 6 periods. So the first period would be immediately after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. So the Qur'an is revealed over a period of 23 years. During that period, the Qur'an isn't a codex. And what I mean by that is that the Qur'an isn't in a book form between 2 covers. This is something that only happens after the death of the Prophet. And when we go to the classical narrations that describe this, a battle takes place in 632, the Battle of Yamama, and a lot of the Huffaz who had memorized the Qur'an, they're killed in this battle. And then this raises a concern about the loss of the Qur'an, because those that had memorized the Qur'an are dying in this battle. And so what the traditional narratives they portray is that Umar goes to Abu Bakr and suggests that the Qur'an should be compiled. The compiled should be compiled together to prevent its loss. And Abu Bakr then decides to do this.
So prior to this, it's preserved orally, is that the understanding?
So primarily it's preserved orally, but at the same time we know from the sources that it was also preserved on kind of perishable items. So things like bones, animal bones, things like leaves, palm leaves, things like parchment, which is animal skin. So it was preserved materially and also predominantly circulated orally through recitation.
And 7th century Arabia, paper isn't...
Yeah, I mean, paper doesn't exist, obviously. It's only introduced in the Middle East hundreds of years afterwards. So paper as a concept doesn't exist. Although parchment, there are narrations that talk about parchment, which is animal skin. That does exist. So Umar goes to Abu Bakr and says, something needs to be done about this. We should collate the Qur'an into one codex. And so Abu Bakr then appoints the Prophet's scribe Zayd ibn Thabit to kind of lead on this collection process. And so what Zayd does is he collects all of these written aspects of the Qur'an that are scattered in all of these different discrete materials, and he cross-checks them with the oral recitation. So if someone he would get a material that has a verse from the Qur'an, he would check it that someone recites it orally from at least 2 sources, and then they would be put as part of the codex. And eventually the Qur'an is then made into the first time into a codex, and it's after Abu Bakr's death, it's then passed on to Umar. This is what the sources say. And then after Umar, it's passed on to his daughter Hafsa, who's also the wife of the Prophet. And then Hafsa has this codex of the Qur'an.
So the traditional argument there is that there's an entire codex, a compilation of the Qur'an compiled at the time of Abu Bakr.
Exactly.
But it wasn't there at the time of the Prophet.
It wasn't at that. So when we can first talk about a codex, we can only talk about it after the death of the Prophet, as a mushaf or a codex of the Qur'an. Okay. So now we come to what I'd say is the second stage in the Qur'an's kind of historical journey. This is arguably perhaps one of the most important stages, and this is something known as the codification of Uthman, or Uthman's codification of the Qur'an. So during the time of Uthman, we're talking about a time where the Muslim kind of community is expanding drastically and dramatically from its previous heartland of Arabia towards Mesopotamia and pushing up more further north and so on. And at this period of time, what the sources say is there tends to be a dispute amongst the armies, amongst the soldiers in the armies, in the way that the Qur'an is being recited amongst the various Muslims in this army. And in particular, it seems to be that in one of these military campaigns in Armenia and Azerbaijan, that it becomes a serious cause of consternation and almost disunity amongst members of the army. And one of the military commanders, by the name of Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman, he then goes and reports this to Uthman sometime in his reign between 644 and 656. And Uthman then decides to standardize the Qur'an amongst the Muslims. And so he orders a committee, again with Zayd ibn Thabit, but assisted by other companions like Abdullah bin Zubayr, Sa'd ibn al-As. And he asks for the manuscript that Hafsa had to be given. And then we have this another codification that happens. And there are specific aspects of this collection of Uthman. So, for example, there's this incident where there's a disagreement on how to write the word tabut, if it should be as tabut or tabu. And Uthman instructs that it should be written according to the dialect of the Quraysh. So the codex itself, it seems to be, is written in the dialect of the Quraysh. And then after this codex is completed, it's then sent to the various heartlands of the Muslim world. So it's originally in Medina, but it's also then sent to Mecca, it's sent to Kufa, it's sent to Basra, it's sent to Damascus. And crucially, what Uthman also does is he orders for any variants that are not in accord with this copy to be burnt and to be destroyed.
I mean, that's a really interesting point regarding the appointment of Zayd as the kind of key arbiter of authenticity. I mean, there does seem to be slight overlaps between the story regarding the compilation during the period of Abu Bakr and Uthman, and it may simply have been the case that similar people were involved in both compilations or the canonization of both compilations. Is that something that has popped up in research?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, there are those that tend, because it's eerily similar actually. So both of the codifications are prompted by something to do with an army and something to do with a battle. Both of them feature Zayd ibn Thabit as a prominent figure who's doing the collection. And I mean, even just thinking about it logically for a second, if Abu Bakr's done this huge, immense kind of difficult process of codifying and getting witnesses and making sure, why do that thing all over again? So there is scholarship that looks at this and sometimes maybe looks at the initial codification and says, okay, maybe did that actually happen? because the codification of Uthman is more strongly attested in terms of narratives and narrations. So that there is a tendency there in the scholarship, but there's also a tendency to try and harmonize both. Like, how do you make sense of both? And so people like Mustafa al-A'zami, for example, he says, yes, it did happen both, and Zayd ibn Thabit did do it both, and it was a very arduous thing. But the second collection of Uthman was more symbolic in the sense that it allowed more people to take part in the codification. So more witnesses would come, or more people would recite. So there are different ways of trying to approach it, but that is definitely a question that we see.
And if that is the case, then would it just be the case that the narrative attributing it to Abu Bakr is the same narrative as Uthman's, but just being projected earlier?
Exactly. If someone were to see that more skeptically or so on, then because the narratives are so similar, then perhaps that earlier one is maybe not the actual one, and Uthman's one is the actual historical compilation. But like I said, it's a matter of interpretation and how you view it. And there are definitely scholars who have tried to make sense of both of it. In fact, in the book itself, there's one chapter that actively tries to make sense of both of these two compilations.
Okay, and then after this period, what we might refer to as the Uthmanic Codex, that becomes the key text that everybody is now referring to?
Yes, so the codification of Uthman happens, what we refer to as the Codex of Uthman. And the reason I say it's the most significant is because even when we refer to the Mus'haf, we refer to it as the Uthmanic Mus'haf. That is what we refer to it as. And there's another important point to bear in mind here as well, is the orthography of the Uthmanic Codex it becomes relatively stable. The way the Codex is written at that time is the way it remains until even in the modern period. And the reason why this is important is because the way the Uthmanic script is written, or the Uthmanic Codex is written, is actually very different from the way we write modern standard Arabic. There are a lot of differences. And this is referred to as the Rasm al-Uthmani or Rasm al-Mus'haf. So there's a few things to bear in mind here. So the first thing is, in the scholarship, the script itself is referred to as a defective script, and it's not a value judgment. It's not defective in the sense as a value judgment, but because of the nature of the script. And predominantly two things that we can say straight away that would differ from a modern writing of the Arabic language to that would be the lack of, not the lack, I mean, in some of these early manuscripts, you do see dots, but they're not used consistently or frequently. So the practice of dotting did exist, but the Mus'haf itself is not consistently dotted. So, for example, the letter ta or the letter ya, unless someone knew the prior recitation, you wouldn't be able to decipher it just by looking at the text itself. So that's one aspect.
So it's almost like the skeleton of the script.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Yeah, so it's like the skeleton. With the script, you have the skeletal form, and you can kind of read things into it based on a prior reading of the Qur'an, or one could potentially read something a little bit differently, and it can accommodate, the skeletal form can accommodate either the ta or the ba or the ya, for example.
But it's fair to say that most Muslims today, if they saw the Uthmanic script, would struggle to read that.
I think so. If unless someone was already a hafiz and knew what that word is, they would have to decipher what that is. So but wait, it's not even actually the dots either. It's also the diacritical marks or the short vowels.
Yeah, no, but I think that's what I want to just emphasize here. I mean, most people would recognize, perhaps most people are aware of, the diacritical marks coming at the time of Hajjaj, as an example. But we're talking about the step prior to that. Right, the Uthmanic Codex or the earliest Mus'haf formed, or the script, the orthography at that point doesn't even contain the dots.
No, I mean, like I said, inconsistently, there are manuscripts that could have it, but there would be definitely lines that one would look at and you wouldn't know what the word is, unless you already knew what that word was, having memorized it. So, I mean, by the way, I mean, you mentioned like harakat and things like this. So interestingly enough, that wasn't the first stage in distinguishing letters. It wasn't through these vowel signs like the fatha, the dhamma, and the kasra. What we see in the earlier period is the practice of using dots. or different colored dots. So, for example, to distinguish certain vowels, a red dot could be used. To distinguish or to highlight that there is a hamza here, a yellow dot would be used. We don't see that anymore, but definitely we see this in some of the earlier manuscripts, that these differentiations happen through the practice of different colored dots. But eventually...
I was just laughing because maybe the color-coded tajweeds are not as innovative as people might think.
Yeah.
So just
That's
to
a good
clarify
point.
then,
Yeah.
clarify.
That's actually a good point. Yeah.
So some of these early Qur'ans were using color-coded dots.
Colored dots.
Colored dots.
To distinguish vowels, or to distinguish, like if there was a hamza there, to aid in the reading of the
because
text.
the fatha dhamma kasra wasn't being used.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's really fascinating.
Which actually does tie in with the modern color-coded.
Yeah.
So I've never actually thought about that.
No, but it's interesting because what it demonstrates is that people were creative and they were using the technologies they had at that time
in order to make things easier for people to read. Yeah. But eventually, that kind of falls out of fashion, we could say, and there's a more standardized way of differentiating different letters or differentiating different vowels. The process is attributed to different people. So again, the narratives, all these different names crop up. Hajjaj ibn Yusuf is one of them. Abu al-Asad al-Duwali is another one. Al-Khalil ibn Ahmed. So there's all these different names that are postulated. But we know as a reality that the harakat system and the dotting system becomes quite consistent eventually. And even in the modern period, I mean, everybody recites or reads the Qur'an, and it's a default that the dots are going to be there and the harakat is going to be there, even though at this earlier point it wasn't as consistent. So just to go back to the whole thing about the orthography of the Mus'haf, the Arabic language is in a process of development. The Arabic language itself hasn't been standardized during Uthman's time. In fact, the earliest works of grammar, Abu al-Asad al-Duwali or Sibawayh, that comes afterwards. So Arabic as a language isn't even standardized yet. So the Arabic language and its orthography, it develops through time and through history. But the Qur'an kind of becomes static. What I mean by that is the way the orthography was written of the Qur'an, there was a kind of I don't know if the right word is taboo, but there was definitely a thing that we should not change that skeletal form of the Qur'an, even though the Arabic language itself is developing. There's a narration, we find it, Suyuti mentions, where someone comes to Imam Malik and says, the Arabic script is developed, should we change the way we write the Qur'an? And he says, no, we shouldn't do that. We keep the orthography as it is, even though Arabic language itself has now developed. And just to give a few examples of what I mean by the orthography of the Quran. And by the way, this ends up being its own category of study. Ilm al-Rasm, or the study of the Quran's orthography, is its own field that scholars in the medieval period write books about. But some of the differences that I can maybe talk about is, in modern standard Arabic, you would expect certain letters to have certain like the alif, waw, and ya in certain words in modern standard Arabic would be there, but in the Mus'haf it wouldn't be there. Or also vice versa, that the Mus'haf would have an additional waw or a ya or a alif, but in modern standard Arabic you wouldn't have that.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, so for example, the evocative ya ayyuhan nas. You know, someone who's studied Arabic, you'd be like, oh, you spell that as ya alif, right? But in the Quran, there is no alif after the ya. It's connected, the ya is connected to ya ayyuhan nas, so the alif is missing. And instead you have something known as like a dagger alif. You might see this in the Mus'haf, like it's a tiny little mark, and that is there to help and represent the long alif. So that's an example of an alif not being there, where in modern standard Arabic it would be there. An example of where you would expect a letter to be there, but it's not there, is there's an example in Surah Baqarah where Ibrahim, there isn't a ya there. Whereas if you were to write Ibrahim now, you would add the ya in the Ibrahim, but in Surah Baqarah, it's not there. And that has been retained, even in the current Mus'hafs, if somebody sees it. And there's other examples as well, things like the way the Hamza is written. So in modern standard Arabic, we talk about the kursi of the ya, the kursi of the Hamza. So the Hamza could be written on a kind of a ya shape, or an alif shape, or a waw shape. In certain examples in the Quran, there is no chair, so we can't make that distinction. There are also examples of where letters morph into other letters. So, for example, you would expect a certain word to have an alif, but instead you have, and there's actually very famous examples of this, like very popular examples that when one reads the Quran, we kind of brush over it, but it's actually there. So, for example, like the word salah or zakah, if you look at it closely in the Mus'haf, they have a waw there. There's no waw in modern standard Arabic of salah or zakah, but the Mus'haf has waw. So someone who didn't know that might read it as salawah, like as in with the waw. So, but that in itself is because of that original codex. So that was preserved and kept the same, and that wasn't changed. And that's what we mean by ilm Mus'haf, or the orthography of the Quran.
So speaking to that, does that to a certain extent demonstrate the consistency of preservation, that you've got these very particular types of spellings?
Yeah, I would say so.
And they're preserved in numerous manuscripts? I mean, are they preserved in numerous manuscripts?
Well, this is the thing. So you have the archetypal kind of Uthmanic script, or the way, and yeah, I mean, specific ways in which you wouldn't do it now, or even in the medieval period, like Imam Malik's a good example. Like clearly at his time, even then the script has developed to an extent that someone can ask him, can we update the Quran? And I think that is an example of that.
Update the
script, the Mus'haf, so that it kind of is in accord with the way the Arabic is there. And I think that is an example of being strict with preserving how it was at that time and not deviating from that. So I think that is a fair comment to make, that is an example of that preservation.
I'm going to drag you back to something you mentioned earlier, when you noted that during the canonization of the Uthmanic Codex, other versions of the Quran were destroyed, or you mentioned they were burned.
They were burned, yeah.
Was that, I mean, I'd imagine that was controversial at the time. I mean,
yeah.
Was there any pushback? Was that accepted by everybody? Or
Yeah, no, definitely. It was controversial. And the traditional sources very clearly actually depict the fact that Uthman making this decision, well, not necessarily just codifying it, but making the decision to say that if it's not in accord with this codex that's just been compiled and codified, then you need to burn it and you need to destroy it. And there were actually significant dissents. So, well, I mean, when we're talking about codices, sources do talk about codices that were attributed to specific companions. So, for example, codices that were attributed to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Ubay ibn Ka'b. Ali ibn Abi Talib is also said to have had his codex of the Qur'an. And one of the most kind of prominent dissenters to someone who was very clearly very unhappy with the decision of Uthman to say that if it's not in accord with this Mus'haf, then it needs to be burnt, was Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Now, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud is a really interesting case study here, because Abdullah ibn Mas'ud is seen as one of the foremost authorities of the Quran, even amongst the companions. He's not, different companions are portrayed as having different specialities. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud is seen as a preeminent authority on the Quran, like very knowledgeable of the Quran, and he straight up refuses to give his copy of the Quran. And he's very unhappy with also the process of codification as well. The sources talk about some of the differences that were in Abdullah ibn Mas'ud's codex. So an example from Surah Baqarah would be, in the standard recitation would be فَسِيَامُ ثَلَاثَةِ أَيَّامٍ فِي الْحَجِّ. It's in the context of Hajj. Apparently in Ibn Mas'ud's codex it was فَسِيَامُ ثَلَاثَةِ أَيَّامٍ مُتَتَابِعَةٍ فِي الْحَجِّ. So there's an additional word in there. These are the kind of differences apparently that was in Ibn Mas'ud's codex. But it's not actually even words here. There are actually more serious differences that Ibn Mas'ud had with the codified version that Uthman does. The most glaring one is the fact that Ibn Mas'ud didn't consider the last two chapters of the Qur'an as being part of the Qur'an. So Surah Nas and Surah Falaq, he saw them as supplications or protection from evil. And in fact, there's narrations which say that he would scrape off these last two chapters and say, don't put in the Qur'an, that is not what is part of the Qur'an. Another issue that Abdullah ibn Mas'ud has is with the appointment of Zayd ibn Thabit himself. So Zayd ibn Thabit is part of the kind of the younger generation of companions. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud is older, and the sources depict he vocalizes his disapproval of Zayd ibn Thabit occupying such an eminent position, an important position in the Qur'an's codification. So there are narrations of things like Abdullah ibn Mas'ud saying that Zayd ibn Thabit was in the loins of a disbelieving man while Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was a Muslim, or other narrations where Zayd ibn Thabit was a young boy with braided hair running around playing while Ibn Mas'ud had recited 70 chapters to the Prophet. So there's another thing we need to bear in mind as well, with the fact that Uthman sends copies of the Mus'haf. So there's this master copy that's done in Medina, and it's sent to the heartlands of the Muslim world. So Mecca, Basra, Kufa, Damascus, that kind of thing. What we see from the traditional sources is that there were actually discrepancies, and it's something we have to bear in mind. There were discrepancies between the codices that Uthman himself, or well, maybe not Uthman directly, but the Uthmanic codexes that were sent to the different heartlands. There were still subtle differences between the Mus'hafs. There were still differences in the orthography. And we see this. So there's different work. There's a genre of literature that actually deals with this as well. So for example, Ibn Abi Dawood's Kitab al-Masahif, he recounts what the differences in the Mus'hafs were. So between the Mus'haf in Medina versus the one that was sent to Mecca. Abu Ubaid al-Qasim ibn Sallam is another example of this as well. He also writes a work that details the differences in the manuscripts that were sent to the different heartlands.
Sorry, just to digress a little bit, do we have any of these manuscripts? Are there any of them extant, or?
So we don't have we can talk about manuscripts later, but we don't really have the Uthmanic manuscripts or the manuscripts that were sent to the heartlands. But there have been studies that have tried to trace archetypes from later manuscripts, and they seem to show a level of consistency with a group of manuscripts that have these similarities that might have been sent to one region, or another group of manuscripts that consistently are, the orthography relates to what might have been sent to another region. So we don't have those manuscripts. But there is an argument to be had that we can maybe retrace that with the manuscripts that we do have that are based on that.
Okay, just quickly then on the point that you just made, that there were scholars who said there were slight differences between these different versions. What kind of, when we're talking about differences, what does that look like?
Yeah, so the differences would be at that skeletal level. So just to give an example, so Ibn Sallam, he says that when you compare the manuscript of Medina with the manuscript of Mecca, there were 12 differences.
And again, this is differences in the orthography.
Orthography, yeah.
Okay.
And so there were 12 between the Mecca and the Medina one. But then with the Mecca, the manuscript that was sent to Mecca to the one that was sent to Iraq, there was another 28. And then you factor in Ibn Abi Dawood. He also includes other kind of differences in orthography. So there are differences. And so just to give you examples of what some of these differences would be. So some of these examples include things like, so for example, سارعوا إلى مغفرة. One of the codices, instead of سارعوا, it was وسارعوا. So you have this addition of the waw. Another example would be something like, instead of فتوكل, it's وتوكل. So instead of the fa, it's the letter waw. Or even things like, instead of minhuma, it's minha, or something like this. So these are the kind of orthographical differences that you see in the classical sources between the different ones.
So, off the back of that, would it be fair to say that at this point these written codices are being used as aids, but primarily the Qur'an still remains an oral tradition?
Yeah, and this is why there's such an emphasis placed on the oral tradition, because if you don't have that prior oral tradition, then you can potentially read things in different ways. So I think it is fair to say that the oral tradition, at least classically the way it's been articulated, is that there is an emphasis on that oral memorization, and the text kind of becomes secondary, or you through a teacher or something like this.
Okay, so you've mentioned those stages as the earliest stages in the compilation of the Quran and the history of the Quran. So what comes next? I mean, is that the end of the story now? You know, the Uthmanic Codex is canonized, it's sent around the world, and that's the end of the conversation?
No, no. So, kind of the story continues. When we're talking about the next stage, there's an important figure we have to know of, and this is the figure of someone by the name of Abu Bakr ibn Mujahid. Ibn Mujahid is operating around 250, 300 years after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, in the 9th and 10th century. So the Uthmanic Codex is very successful. I mean, we can say it was definitely very successful because nobody is now using really other codices.
Yeah, I mean, everyone around the world, all Muslims are using the Uthmanic
exactly.
Codex.
But even in that period, in Ibn Mujahid's time, in the 9th, 10th century. But remember we said that the Mus'haf was in its skeletal form. So that leads, the door is open. Like, just an example of a, like, let's say the letter ba with the teeth of the ba, that could be the ba, it could be a ta, it could be a tha, right? It could be a ya, right? So that avenue is there for multiplicity in deciphering or reading that the text. And we do have variances. We have multiple variants. And also when you factor in the fact that the different codices also had orthographical differences, you do have variances in the recitation. So we come to the figure of Ibn Mujahid. Ibn Mujahid is this prominent scholar of the Qur'an. He's based in Baghdad, and he does something that really shapes the history of the Qur'an. What he does is he decides in his book, Kitab al-Sab'a, he selects 7 readings of the Qur'an. And he says these are the 7 that are the most prominent, the most authentic, and it's through these 7 that we should recite the Qur'an. And these 7 are referred to as the qira'at, the sab'a qira'at.
The 7 qira'at.
The 7, exactly.
That everyone is
exactly, yes. So
familiar with today.
Yes. So when we hear qira'at being mentioned, it's Ibn Mujahid who really is the person who is responsible for championing the 7 qira'at.
But just for clarification, at this point, what we're talking about is not orthographical differences?
No. So the orthography is fixed, even though there might be some orthographical differences with the codices. But the difference we're talking about is the deciphering of the orthography.
Okay.
So Ibn Mujahid selects from, I mean, there's different numbers that are given. There were 50 eminent reciters in all the different places of the Muslim world. And out of all of them, Ibn Mujahid selects 7, right? And these 7 are Nafi', Ibn Kathir, Abu Amr, Ibn Amir, Asim, Hamza, and Al-Kisai.
Probably worth noting that this isn't Ibn Kathir the Mufassir.
Yes, exactly. So Ibn Kathir the Mufassir is someone who comes a lot later. This is Ibn Kathir the reciter. So he selects the 7, and there were others that were circulating at that time, like Hassan al-Basri. And in fact, we'll come to this, but later on, more reciters are actually also added. But let's stick to the 7 for now. And these 7 were, well, 4 of them came from specific parts of the Muslim world. So, for example, Nafi' was the reader of Medina, Ibn Kathir was the reader of Mecca, Abu Amr was the reciter in Basra, Ibn Amir was the reciter in Damascus, and then Asim, Hamza, and Al-Kisai, all 3 of them were kind of the main readers of Kufa.
But, okay, so at this point, Ibn Mujahid selects 7 that he argues are the most authentic from this larger number. You mentioned 50. And so earlier on, we've mentioned the kind of canonization of the codex and acceptance of that codex by Caliph Uthman at that time. And now we've got, could we say a second canonization? I don't know, but Ibn Mujahid's selection of these 7. What are the types of differences that we're talking about in their recitations of the Quran?
I think we can call this the next canon. So if you accept Abu Bakr's as the first canonization, that would be the first. and then Uthman being the second canonization, and then Ibn Mujahid would definitely be another canonization, whatever number you put at it, 3 or 2, whatever. But Ibn Mujahid would definitely be seen as the next step in the Qur'an's canonization. So in terms of differences, the differences stem from pronunciation of words to actual word changes. So we can start with the pronunciation changes. In fact, there's quite a famous video that was circulating.
وغلقت الأبواب وقالت هيت لك وقالت هيت لك وقالت هيت لك وقالت هيت لك وغلقت الأبواب وقالت هيت لك قال معاذ الله.
He recites from Surah Yusuf the phrase hayta lak, and there's multiple ways that word hayta is done. So hayta lak, hita lak, hittu lak, and things like this. So that is one of the pronunciation, but also things like something known as imala. And imala is like this air sound. So, for example, in the recitation of Hafs and Asim, وَقَالَ ارْكَبُوا فِيهَا بِسْمِ اللَّهِ مَجْرِيهَا. In fact, I mean, this is the recitation everybody recites in, like 95% of the world. That is the only example in Hafs where you have that air sound. There is nowhere else in the recitation of Hafs where you have majri, like an air sound. But I mean, Shu'bah, which is another transmission, doesn't have majriha, it's majriha or something like this.
And arguably that's more representative of the other recitations?
Well, it depends. It depends on the Rawi, which we'll come to.
Okay.
Anyway, but yeah, so pronunciation. So imala can be another example of a pronunciation difference. So another example would be the word Qur'an itself. Qur'an is read as Qur'an, but also in certain eponymous readings, it's Qur'an, right? Without that stopping of the Qur'an. So that's another kind of pronunciation difference we can see. But we also see word differences as well. And I think the most famous one is in the Fatiha, Maliki Yawmiddin, Maliki Yawmiddin. Those are two different words. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, like for example, Maliki is owner, and Maliki is king, and both of them are acceptable readings depending on which reader that you select. But actually, it's even just to talk about Maliki and Maliki Yawmiddin, in the recitation of Abu Amr, the pronunciation is also different. So it's Milki Yawmiddin or Malki Yawmiddin. So you have pronunciation and words. Another example of word changes could be something like, this is where Hafs is very different, the 195% of the world reciting, in the context of Riyaha Bushra, right? In Hafs, or the recitation of Asim, it's Bushra, the word is Bushra, whereas all the rest of the 6, they use the root Nashara instead of Bashara. So, and that's a difference between whether you're saying to bring forth clouds or to bring forth glad tidings. So that's an example of word differences.
Just on that point, I mean, because you mentioned Hafs and Asim a few times, and you said 95% of the world read according to that. I mean, in terms of the other 6 recitations, are they still found? I know, obviously, we mentioned Warsh is in North Africa. You'll still find that recitation.
So it's Warsh and Nafi', obviously. I'm going to come to this,
okay.
but just broadly speaking, so in North Africa, Warsh is recited. In Sudan, I believe some of the other recitations are also recited. But broadly speaking, Hafs is basically the dominant recitation. But they are used. I mean, the other ones are used at a lot more of a minor level.
Is it more of a specialization then?
Definitely, it's a specialization. So now there's a thing about the Qur'an, like Qaris who understand the ilm al-qira'at. They would have mastered all 7, and they would very comfortably switch. And people do recite that in like Taraweeh or different contexts, that they would be very comfortable in reciting in the different way. But as a practice, in terms of like the general population, then it's definitely much more restrictive. So there's an important thing that we need to bear in mind here. There's no such thing as the reading of Nafi' or Asim, because we don't have... Because because there are intermediaries between Nafi' or Asim and Ibn Mujahid, who records the reading of the eponymous readers. So there's intermediaries between them. And so, and by the way, the intermediaries also differ from the reading. So, for example, let's take Asim as an example. Between Asim and Ibn Mujahid, there are kind of a list of different intermediaries. Two become normalized, as in Hafs and Shu'bah, but there were others as well. And they differed as well. So there was differences between the way Hafs would say Asim recited something versus the way Shu'bah would say Asim recited something. So that's something that we need to bear in mind. And at this stage, Ibn Mujahid, he does lean towards specific rawis over other rawis, and eventually they do become canonized as the primary rawis for that eponymous reader. But he doesn't restrict himself to two or anything like this. And actually, in fact, he doesn't even hesitate to criticize some of the rawis that actually end up becoming canonical. So in his Kitab al-Sab'a, he does critique, he even actually also critiques sometimes even the readers themselves. This is something that is probably important to bear in mind. So there are examples where he critiques the reading of Ibn Amir or the reading of Hamza. Something that was quite scandalous was that there are examples of where he criticizes Qunbul. And Qunbul becomes one of the rawis of Ibn Kathir. And the reason why it's scandalous is because Qunbul was the teacher of Ibn Mujahid. So he kind of critiques his own teacher. So there are other scholars that found that a little bit scandalous. So here's the thing. Now, Ibn Mujahid's selection of the seven, we could say was a subjective thing, based on what he felt was authentic or correct. And it was by no means unanimously agreed upon and everybody agreed upon it, at least in that period. So can use...
Sorry, was there pushback from other scholars?
Yeah, so...
And who were they?
Yeah, so if we take a step back, if we look at... prior to Ibn Mujahid writing his Kitab al-Sab'a, we have a very famous scholar of the Qur'an, Imam al-Tabari, right? Everybody who has studied anything to do with Quranic studies has to know who Tabari is or reads about Tabari. So Tabari is this, huge mufassir. What's interesting about Tabari is he comes before Ibn Mujahid. So Ibn Mujahid, what Ibn Mujahid is doing, Tabari isn't around at this point. So Tabari, of course, he compiles his tafsir of the Qur'an. But what's interesting is that there are examples in which he basically disagrees with the readings of the eponymous readers that Ibn Mujahid selects. In fact, there's been studies that have done, and I think one source says that there's up to 89 examples where Tabari just disagrees with the readings of any of the seven. Like he just doesn't find it right. I mean, he just says that they're wrong readings. And just to give an example, in Surah Maryam, for example, most of the readers read a phrase in Surah Maryam as li'ahaba, whereas in the reading of Abu Amr, he reads this as liyahaba with a ya. And Tabari, in his commentary, when he's discussing this in his tafsir, he says he disagrees with it. He just blatantly says it's wrong. So there is that element of subjectivity, because Tabari is clearly disagreeing with the selection that Ibn Mujahid does. There's other examples as well. So, for example, تَسْأَلُونَ بِهِ وَالْأَرْحَامَ. And the six of the eponymous readers read this as arhama, but Hamza, he reads this in the accusative as arhami. And Tabari, he says, quite bluntly, he says this is wrong, like it's grammatically awkward, and he disagrees with it. But what's interesting is that Ibn Mujahid, he kind of says that this is the author. So there is that distinction and differentiation.
What's the significance of that then, that we're seeing Tabari essentially criticizing readings that Ibn Mujahid is validating?
I would say that what we could say as a consequence of that is that it wasn't that the seven that Ibn Mujahid picks is a process of ijtihad. It's something that he does, what he feels to be authentic, and that doesn't mean everybody just says, yeah, we all agree with it. In fact, Suyuti himself, and there are other scholars who say, like, why restrict to seven? There were others that were equally valid or more valid even. And in fact, I mean, there are there are even disagreements on the 7 as well. Like, even after Ibn Mujahid, specifically the readings of Hamza, Al-Kisai, and Ibn Amir, we see critiques from different scholars. Like, there's a narration from Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who apparently had a disagreement with the reading of Hamza. Like, he that was something that he was not too comfortable with. Imam al-Dhahabi mentions how Hamza's reading, it was kind of prevented to be recited in the Grand Mosque of Wasit because people didn't agree with it. They didn't like that particular reading. And the reasons that are given is because of the style of Hamza. There's frequent pauses in his recitation. He has the imala there. There's also the lengthening of the vowels, so the mudud, the mad is a lot longer. But what we could say is it probably has to do with locality and what people were familiar with. Because bear in mind, the 7 reciters were picked. And I think Tabari also does this because in Tabari, when he mentions a reading, he seems to gravitate towards ijma', as in the consensus. So a certain locality, they tend to read in that way generally. So he kind of accepts that. And then and to be fair, he mentions the eponymous readers by name when they maybe disagree with something. So he kind of sees it through the lens of ijma', because and arguably maybe that's what Ibn Mujahid did as well. That there was an ijma' on, like, let's say the Meccans all kind of that was the popular reading, so I'm going to pick Nafi', like that.
I mean, you can see even in the modern day how that would work when you have people familiar with a particular reading and you have a qari coming in who perhaps reads in a different style. People find it quite strange.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. No, that's actually a good example. In fact, I remember when many years ago, when it was during Tarawih prayers, there was a qari from Egypt who was reciting in all of the different riwayas throughout all of Ramadan. And then he came to the last juz, the 30th juz, which is the juz everybody knows, because nobody knows any of the other juz. And then after he finishes the salam, there's this huge outcry, like, what is he reading? We know these chapters and he's not saying it correctly. And so actually that does make sense. And you can imagine, let's say somebody's not familiar with the reading of Hamza in a specific city, that they would find that very controversial because of the stopping, because of the mad and all of this kind of stuff. So I don't think it's something, I mean, it makes sense that why people would disagree. But I should add, like, the Kufans had no issue with Hamza's recitation. Scholars that originate from Kufa, you don't see disagreements because they were probably brought up and they read this. You know, we're lucky we live in a technological age and everything's at our fingertips. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years ago where things are not moving as quickly and recitations are maybe more prominent in specific localities. So that's, I would say, definitely the case.
Does it also speak to the strength of classical scholarship that they were openly discussing all of these issues, exploring them, disagreeing with one another, and there doesn't seem to be any shying away from some of these issues?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, but I mean, everything that I'm saying is recorded in our own books.
This isn't.
No, this isn't. This was openly discussed amongst the kind of the scholars of the Qur'an and yeah, it wasn't really an issue in that sense. And there was that healthy, I mean, disagreement. Like, I mean, one scholar disagreeing with this reading, but it was there. We see that was definitely there.
But it shows a level of maturity in the scholarship.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, certainly there was this...
That perhaps might be lacking in...
Yeah, arguably. Perhaps in the modern period, there sometimes is a very kind of narrow way of looking at things, whereas the scholars of the past... They definitely tended to be a lot more open in discussing a lot of these issues. But yeah, just to go back to some of the other differences, disagreements, just to talk about the disagreements. So I've mentioned Tabari already, but a good example of someone who also disagrees with the readings of the 7, like one of the readings of the 7 is Zamakhshari, who comes after Ibn Mujahid. Ibn Mujahid's written Kitab al-Sab'a. He said these are the 7 that everyone should read. These are the most authentic. Zamakhshari comes afterwards. And there are examples in his tafsir where he disagrees with the reading of one of the 7. So just to give the example of Ibn Amir's reading of in Surah An'am of وَكَذَلِكَ زَيَّنَّا لِكَثِيرٍ مِّنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ قَتْلَ أَوْلَادِهِمْ شُرَكَاؤُهُمْ. Ibn Amir recites this verse a little bit differently. In fact, in that verse, there's 4 words that are a bit different. So, for example, he reads zayyana in the passive as zuyina. He reads qatla in the nominative case as qatlu. He reads awladihim as awladahum. And then he reads shuraka'uhum as shurakaihim. So there's 4 kind of changes in that verse. And Zamakhshari disagrees with that in his tafsir. He says, I believe he kind of detests this reading. Like quite strongly, he disagrees with it, and he finds it kind of I don't know what the word to use, but he definitely doesn't agree.
Problematic.
Yeah, he finds that, and he's quite vocal about it. He finds that very problematic. But what's interesting is that clearly there was a difference there because Ibn Mujahid has added the 7, but that doesn't mean that everybody's accepting it. And I mean, we see this even a few hundred years afterwards. I would say the process of codification doesn't happen immediately with Ibn Mujahid, but it takes a few hundred years. So even 200 years after Ibn Mujahid, with people like Al-Juwayni or Ghazali, when they refer back to the readings, they don't refer to them as canonical readings, even though now we refer to them as the 7 canonical readings. They refer to them as qira'a mashhura, like the most prominent. But there's a difference between something being prominent and mashhur or famous and being canonical.
So Ibn Mujahid selects these 7, and these are then passed down. I mean, till the modern day, people still recite according to these 7.
Yes. Well, yeah. So this is the thing. I mean, it doesn't become canon in the sense that.
Just for clarification, so everyone can follow along. When the Qur'an is recited in the modern day, in the various mosques around the world, it is recited according to one of these 7 readings.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Well, like I said, like 95% recite in one.
But in terms of what's considered correct,
it would be of the 7. Yes, exactly. But there's something else that we will have to come to, because that 7 ends up being expanded to 10, which I'm going to come back to. I'll come back to that point. But just to say, like with the codification of Ibn Mujahid, it doesn't happen immediately. The canonization of Ibn Mujahid doesn't happen immediately, because there are sources that say that other eponymous readings aside from the 7 were also being kind of read in different circles. So like Hasan al-Basri, there are sources that say that the reading of Hasan al-Basri was being recited in certain contexts. And there were other preeminent qurra who eventually also become prominent, which I'll come to. But the question is, who are the intermediaries that we pick?
They're the students of these
No, not
scholars?
necessarily. So this is the thing. For some of the riwayas, it is so. For example, for Nafi', Asim, and Al-Kisai, the Rawi, who end up becoming the Rawi, and the Rawi is the main narrator, as in the intermediary.
Because you made the point that we don't have. I mean, we don't have Nafi',
but we only have Nafi' through Warsh, for example. So Warsh is the intermediary. So.
We don't have Asim, we have Asim through Hafs.
Exactly, or Asim through Shu'bah. So, so just to answer your question, no. So, with the 7, the immediate students, it's not always the immediate students. The 3 in which they are the immediate students is with Nafi', Asim, and Al-Kisai. So their immediate students are the intermediaries. So Shu'bah and Hafs were the actual students of Nafi'. But that's not the case with the others. So for example, with Ibn Kathir, Ibn Amir, and Hamza, the Rawis are selected not from the immediate students, but the generation after that. And I mean, there's reasons for that, because it has to do with corroborating who was doing it, where was the majority. Abu Amr is an interesting example, because he has numerous transmitters, immediate transmitters, but later on it seems to be the case that Al-Yazidi is seen as the most prominent kind of intermediary. And so, interestingly enough, the 2 Rawis of Abu Amr come through one person, which is Al-Yazidi, and they are Duri and Susi. So those are the 2 Rawis. So, I mean, and I suppose there's a question of why were those Rawis selected over others?
And why 2?
Yeah, why 2? Yeah, so, okay, so So there's a few more names I think we need to talk about that we can give credit to the standardization of the two rawis. Ibn Ghalboon is a name that crops up, the elder, the father, Ibn Ghalboon. But I would say probably one of the most prominent figures is someone by the name of Abu Amr al-Dani. Abu Amr al-Dani, he writes this very influential work entitled At-Taysir fi Qira'at al-Sab'a. And what the Taysir is it's an abridged and a simplified version of the 7 readings to make it easy for students to kind of understand what the 7 are, and so he basically selects. So he plays a prominent role in the consolidation of selecting 2 rawis and who those 2 rawis are of the 7. Another important figure that we need to know about is the figure of Imam al-Shatibi. He composes a work, Hirz al-Amani, but it's more famously known as the Shatibiyah. It's a very famous work, and this is a kind of a versified version that again mentions the Rawi system, and even to this day that is the text that is memorized by scholars all over the world. So they play quite an important role in kind of solidifying and saying that these are the 2 Rawis, that you get the eponymous readers through these 2 Rawis, and that's actually kind of stuck to this day as well, that when we have the readings of the eponymous readers, we do it through those rawis. By the way, I should say, the rawis, the truth is the rawis do differ amongst themselves. Like the different rawis do recite different things based on the so just to give the example of Asim, and we take these 2 rawis of Hafs and Shu'bah. Let's take with the name Mikail, right? So Hafs, in the recitation of Hafs, it's not Mikail, it's Mikael. Whereas Shu'bah doesn't say Mikail, he says Mikail. But then they're both saying that it comes from Asim. So this is the thing here.
Sorry, just for clarification. So you've got these 2 rawis,
yes,
coming or narrating from Asim.
Yes.
And
there's differences
between them.
Exactly. But it's not just them. There are other rawis as well. But it just happens to be that those are the 2 that come to be selected as the main 2 transmitters of the eponymous readers.
So each of them, the Shu'bah and Hafs, Hafs recites as Mikael.
Yeah. So Hafs recites it as Mikael, and Shu'bah recites it as Mikail.
Okay.
So and there are other examples as well. So, for example, the word tashtahihi, Hafs recites it as tashtahihi, whereas Shu'bah recites it as tashtahih, as in without the additional ha. So, yeah, so those are the 2. So 2 rawis. So that stage is the consolidation of 2 rawis for every 7. So now we end up with 14. You've got the 7 eponymous readers, and those 7 are accessed through 2 rawis each, making 14 transmissions of the Qur'an. I've mentioned that you don't get Asim except through the rawis, and just to make things a little bit more complicated.
Oh, because they're not complicated enough.
You don't get the rawis except through certain turuq. So in a strange way, even Hafs and Asim, there's no. I'm not going to say there's no such thing as Hafs and Asim, but there are multiple ways of getting Hafs and Asim. And this is where we have this notion of the turuq or tariq. So there are different ways that you get to the rawis in the first place. And that in itself was also a process of selection.
And this is different from Sufi tariqas, just for any of you that might be a little bit confused.
Yeah, no, of course, no. So this has to do with the chain of transmission to the rawi. So just to give an example, there are 9 different variants or turuq of Hafs and Asim. There are 9 different ways that we get. There are 9 turuq of Hafs and Asim, and there are 9 different people.
But we have consolidated readings of Hafs and Asim, right? Like, so for example,
but that's a process of selection as well. This is the point. So Hafs and it's Hafs and Asim. This is the thing. It's Hafs and Asim through the turuq of Amr ibn Sabbah. That is the turuq that is used. Specialists of qira'at would know this because there's different tariqas, but specific turuq end up becoming the dominant turuq of the reading of the rawis.
Right.
But I did hear from one of our colleagues that actually, again, something I probably would need to look into, but in places in North Africa, apparently they use different turuq. So the turuq of Warsh or Qalun is not the turuq that might traditionally been seen, but they use a different turuq, like but yeah, as in someone who comes afterwards. Interestingly enough, actually, just to also say, if it hasn't been complicated enough, sometimes the rawis can actually be in the turuq itself. So Al-Kisai of the seven, Al-Kisai is the youngest of the seven eponymous readers. But he is also one of the transmitters of Shu'bah's recitation. So Asim, Shu'bah, and then one of the turuq actually comes through Al-Kisai. But he's got his own reading as well. So yeah, so these scholars were actually, there was this dynamic process of scholars knowing different turuq and things like this. But Al-Kisai is one of the tariqas of Shu'bah, but he doesn't end up becoming the main turuq. But we know him more as having his own reading, as being one of the eponymous readers. But I do want to mention Ibn al-Jazari because it is important. Ibn al-Jazari, in his time, he kind of laments this thing that people consider only the turuq that are found in the Taysir and the Shatibiyya as being authentic. And he says, no, there are actually other turuq that are equally valid, but people aren't reading it or people aren't knowing about it. So it's just something to bear in mind. So just to kind of recap, you have the eponymous readers. After the eponymous readers, you have the rawis. And after the rawis, you have the turuq. And that is the chain through where you have the eponymous readers. Okay, so now we come to another stage in the Qur'an's codification, and this relates to the figure of another important personality that we know, and this is someone I've already mentioned, but this is the figure of Ibn al-Jazari. So Ibn al-Jazari comes along and he expands upon the seven readers. He says that actually there's another three that are equally valid and they should also be equally seen as authoritative and should also be seen as canon. And so he composes this work known as the Durra al-Muddiyah, and he adds another three eponymous readers to the seven that Ibn Mujahid already added. So he adds Abu Ja'far, Yaqub and Khalaf. And we were talking about this whole interplay with transmitters and Rawi. Khalaf is actually one of the transmitters of Hamza. Khalaf is one of the Rawis of Hamza, but with Ibn al-Jazari, Khalaf has his own, becomes an eponymous reader as well. So it's just an interesting overlap that we sometimes see. By the way, this isn't anything new. Ibn al-Jazari is important because he does so successfully. And the 10 end up, and so the 7 become the 10. And the 10 end up becoming accepted, and you can recite the Qur'an through these 10 ways. So
now, in contemporary times, do people accept 10 readings rather than 7?
Yes, so the 10 are now accepted. From the 7, the 10 are now accepted. But like I said, it's not anything that was controversial. Previous scholars had also tried to add more to the 7. People felt that Ibn Mujahid shouldn't have restricted himself to the 7. He should have championed others, like Ibn Mihran is a good example, who's 400 years before Ibn al-Jazari, and he's saying there should be more. What seems to be the case is that in Andalusia and North Africa, there tends to be an acceptance of the 7 that Ibn Mujahid kind of sets. But in more kind of the eastern regions, people tend to go beyond the 7. And so recitations like Abu Ja'far or Yaqub and Khalaf, they were recited. And so eventually they become canonized in the sense that they become also part of the 10 that are accepted to be recited.
And again, could we put this down to geography and locales and what people are familiar with?
Exactly. Because like I said,
because a reading that may sound authentic or acceptable in one part of the world
may not be so in another region if you're not used to that, and they can sound very different. Like these different recitations can sound very different. But Ibn al-Jazari is important because of what he writes, and in fact Ibn al-Jazari's Taybat al-Nashr and Shatibi's work, we could say are the 2 most important works of qira'at. For any students of qira'at, they're memorized by students, and it is through these 2 works that these experts or scholars that know about the qira'at, they are able to kind of recite all these different ways. But I should add, even though Shatibi is important because Ibn al-Jazari is important because he successfully adds another 3. But even after Ibn al-Jazari, there are those that try to add more. So there's this whole movement of trying to add an additional 4 to the 10. So Ad-Dimyati is a good example where he tries to add Ibn al-Muhaysan, al-Yazidi, A'mash, Hasan al-Basri's recitation. But this guy doesn't really pick up. So generally what comes to be accepted is the 10 through the 2 rawis each.
And does this maybe also speak to the strength of classical scholarship, the dynamism, creativity, the fact that these conversations are being had across centuries, across different geographical areas, different dynasties, and a deep veneration for the Qur'an in all of these different time periods.
Definitely,
people are they want to read the Qur'an correctly. They are constantly and consistently refining these different positions.
So it actually reminds me of something. It's quite interesting. There's been studies that have compared the variances in the qira'at with variances in another genre of literature that is from that time, which is pre-Islamic poetry, Jahili poetry. And Jahili poetry is transmitted through variances as well. There are different words, and so it's quite similar. But what's really interesting is that there are less variances that are transmitted with Jahili poetry than there are with the qira'at. And you're probably thinking, like, how can that be the case? Because people took the kind of the license to, if they were kind of reciting some kind of a poem and they felt there was a grammatical mistake, they would just happily just change it. But whereas scholars were very meticulous because they were kind of transmitting what they had heard, so that's why you end up with more variances, because they were trying to transmit what's there, and
because
you have more.
There's a level of care,
exactly,
and people want to get things right
to preserve what they heard, and in a way that's why you end up with more variances. But anyway, so that takes us now to maybe the last stage, the final stage, we could say, in this broad kind of categorization that I've said, and this is a very recent, relatively speaking, we can say canonization of the Qur'an, and this happens in 1924.
And arguably, maybe even the most important.
Yeah, we could say that as well, and I think there's an argument to be had. So what happens in 1924 is that under the auspices of King Fuad, he kind of charges a group of scholars from Jam al-Azhar in Egypt to kind of. And by the way, this is where print is widespread now, kind of the widespread printing press, the mass production of books. So he kind of charges this group of scholars from Azhar to kind of standardize a mushaf. And this mushaf becomes known as the Amiri mushaf. But what's interesting about this period is the decision that this group of scholars make, in which, because remember, we've said there's 7, 10, and then all the rawis.
Potentially 14.
Potentially 14, exactly. So what they do is they make a very important decision. And that important decision is that they decide to pick the reading of Hafs and Asim. That the Amiri Musaf is going to contain the reading of Hafs and Asim. Now, that isn't a novel thing, because the Ottomans had already done that. The reading of the Ottomans was Hafs. So it was probably a kind of an organic process. But that is a critical point, because they choose the reading of Hafs and Asim. Arguably, this is why 95% of the world read in Hafs and Asim, and people all over the world read in that sense.
And is this also the dawn of the cassette player?
Yeah, so this is where now we've got a different dimension here. Previously, if you wanted to read the Qur'an, you'd have to hear it directly from a teacher in whatever location. Whereas now, you've got cassettes, you've got the radio. The radio was a big thing. So in Egypt, you have people like Husari, who records the complete recitation of the Qur'an. He does that in Hafs as well.
Now you've got professional reciters that become popular as well.
Professional reciters become popular, specifically within the Egypt context. And that is an organic way where recitation ends up spreading.
But it also normalizes particular readings.
Exactly. So if someone is now listening to a cassette, and Hafs is the one that's being recited, one might erroneously assume that this is the correct reading of the Qur'an. But hopefully, as I've said, it can be. But this is just one of potential others. And actually, often we see this as the case, that quite wrongly, Hafs and Asim is seen as the standard recitation. So we read everything through the lens of Hafs. And we, in fact, back project everything through the lens of Hafs, which is not accurate at all when you look at the past. Because let's say for example, before the Amiri Mus'haf, hadith books like Bukhari quotes a hadith or a fiqh book. We shouldn't make the assumption that the ayah that's being quoted is the recitation of Hafs. In fact, it probably would be another different riwayah or a different eponymous reading. But sometimes that mistake is then made, and we back project the reading of Hafs to our reading of tafsir, or our reading of fiqh, or our reading of theology, or whatever context quotations of the Qur'an. So that's just something to bear in mind, that the norm is not Hafs. Hafs is not the norm recitation. It's just one of potentially others.
Hafs has become the norm.
It has become the norm
because of in the 20th
decisions
century
that have happened in history, we can say.
Yeah.
But we should be careful. That's what I'm saying. We should be careful when we read. In fact, I was having a conversation again with one of our colleagues, and he was mentioning about how Bukhari mentions a verse in the Qur'an, and how in that particular book the quotation was in Hafs. But actually, it made more sense if a different riwayah was there. So it's just something to bear in mind when we think about Hafs and Asim, or the different riwayah.
Okay, so I mean, we've run through the 6 stages, let's say, and this very long history, and the number 7, 10, and 14. I mean, to put it simply, how do we make sense of all these variances? The idea of having a Qur'an that's been preserved throughout history. How is that reconciled? How do you make sense of that?
So this is where we come to this issue of ahruf. So there is only one, thematically speaking, there is the sole justification for multiplicity and all of these differences has to do with the notion of the ahruf, or the sab'at ahruf, or the 7 ahruf. So there are hadiths that say that the Qur'an was revealed in accordance to sab'at ahruf, or 7 ahruf. Classical mufassirun and classical scholars of the Qur'an, there's no conclusive answer as to what ahruf even means. Suyuti himself recounts at least 40 different positions of what the ahruf means.
Just for clarifications, and so this ahruf are not the qira'at?
No. There are hadiths that say that the Qur'an was revealed according to sab'at ahruf. Qira'at is something that is attached and associated with Ibn Mujahid. In fact, Suyuti, if I remember correctly, himself says that there are people that very wrongly attribute. And there's a criticism of Ibn Mujahid for selecting 7, because then there are people that wrongly get confused and attribute the 7 qira'at as being the 7 ahruf, which is definitely not the case. But there are broader questions. So what are the ahruf, first of all? There's differences of what the ahruf means, and what are the differences of the ahruf. So does it have to do with language? Does it have to do with syntax? Does it have to do with the recitations of different tribes? Does it have to do with synonymous word changes? Like one ahruf has one word, another ahruf has another word. And then there's all these different positions. And there's no kind of agreement to say this is what the ahruf means, even to this day. But then from this, there are other issues. So for example, Uthman's codification. What his kind of the orthography of the Uthmanic script, what's the relationship between the sab'at ahruf and what Uthman codifies and orders to be burned? Again, there's questions around that. And then obviously the bigger question of how does the ahruf then refer to the qira'at? How does it relate to the qira'at? So there are different ways that people have tried to make sense of the sab'at ahruf. Kind of the more popular way that it has been understood, and I think this in itself probably needs another entire podcast, I think, or maybe something we can get back to. But
or people could just buy your book. Or
that as well, I suppose. Yeah. So the popular way we can say, or the way that's commonly used, is that the sab'at ahruf is interpreted literally. That the Qur'an, whatever way it was revealed in 7 different ways. And then the Prophet recited the Qur'an in 7 different ways. And then the qira'at that come afterwards encapsulate the 7 in some way, but we're not sure how. So that's kind of the more popular way that's been seen.
So the variations we have stem back to the different ways that the Prophet recited.
Recited the 7, and he verbatim recited those in 7 different ways. So there's another way of looking and interpreting the notion of the sab'at ahruf. And again, there's a chapter in the book in this as well that refers to this. And this model sees the concept of the sab'at ahruf in a slightly different way. So the sab'at ahruf is seen more as a divine concession that's given to the companions and the people in 7th century Arabia in order to recite the Qur'an so according to this model, the Qur'an was revealed in one way. But there are people, there are different tribes, people pronounce things differently. And so a permission is given by virtue of the Sab'at Ahruf hadith that you can recite slightly differently, let's say in pronunciation and things like this, as long as you don't change the meaning. So the Sab'at Ahruf refer to a concession that's given to the companions to recite that. And this is why when you look back at like certain parts in the history of the Qur'an, why Uthman says that the Qur'an should be written down according to the Quraysh, and this we see this in the narration, that the Qur'an should be written down according to the dialect of the Quraysh because the Qur'an was revealed in the dialect of the Quraysh. So that kind of narration kind of fits into this way of looking at it, that the Qur'an was revealed in one way, but permission is given that if someone slightly, because of pronunciation, says something a bit differently, then not to worry. Like this is still, because there's anxieties that might come across. Like some people might not even be able to pronounce certain things, but it's like, okay, this is fine. It's not as a concession.
It's an interesting argument, but doesn't it kind of contradict what has been the consensus of Muslim scholarship? I mean, has anyone held this position previously?
Well, actually, yes. There's been recent works that have been written. Obviously, there's a chapter in the book here. Other works have also been written. But actually, there are scholars of the past that also seem to have adopted this position. So what comes to mind is scholars like Imam al-Tahawi. He seemed to have this position. Baqillani, Abu Shama. There's an argument that Imam al-Shafi'i also perhaps had this position as well. So there is precedent for this in the classical literature. I've already mentioned Ibn Arabi, Ibn Atiyah. So again, it's not the kind of the major position, but if we look into the past of intellectual history, then we do see this view being articulated. This idea of the Sab'at Ahruf being seen as a concession.
No, I think that's. I mean, it's quite interesting, and as you said, the chapters in the book, and it's got numerous references that that explicate this further.
But just to add something as well, like there are certain parts in history, like narrations that, like so for example, there are narrations that say that Ibn Mas'ud said that certain, like for instance, the names of God that are changed, instead of let's say God being all seeing and all hearing, someone recites Allah is all powerful and all majestic. There are narrations that say that that's fine as long as you don't change the theme of it, and so that would kind of be more in accord with this kind of model. And so there are things in that historical trajectory that kind of lend itself to that. And by the way, I should add, like there's a very famous early Hanafi position that the Qur'an could be recited in Persian, and that would obviously change the syntax of the Qur'an, but not necessarily the meaning. So as long as the meaning is the same, then so that was. But I should add that dispensation that was given with the ahruf, very clearly, even the scholars that do articulate it, that dispensation does not exist after the Uthmanic canonization. That it might have happened then, but right now no one can say a word a little bit differently. But there is that discussion there, and there's a lot more kind of references in the book to that as well. But there's something else I suppose to bear in mind as well, is what was the reason for the Sab'at Ahruf? Like the context of the hadith is to facilitate ease, right? So if people are reading in different ways according to their dialect, it's a bit more easy if they're doing it because that's what the dialect says, as opposed to adhering to some other kind of recitation. So there's something there to just bear in mind.
And there's probably something to be said about knowledge developing in different cultures that speak in different dialects and different languages also. So
the key thing here is those that read the Sab'at Ahruf as being something more as a concession, the Saba is now interpreted more symbolically. And there is precedent for reading numbers symbolically. We know it's not something that we might be familiar in the English language, but those that know Arabic knows that certain numbers have more of a symbolic value. So 4 and its derivatives, but also 7 and its derivatives also have some kind of a symbolic value. So we know that Sab'a kind of in Arabic culture symbolizes perfection and also multitude. So when we say Nazal al-Qur'an ala sab'at ahruf, that the Qur'an was revealed in 7 ways, that's being read as the Qur'an was revealed in multiple ways. But not being revealed, but like that permission, that concession is given that if you've done it a little bit differently, then this is fine. So that's one aspect. I mean, Ibn Khaldun in his Muqaddimah, he observes that Sab'a is a special number. Mas'udi, who's a historian, he also makes this point as well in his Muruj al-Dhahab, and he says Sab'a is everywhere, like the 7 heavens. And the Qur'an actually does this, like 7 heavens, 7 seas. So Sab'a to ahruf, again, that's seen as a concession. So those are the 2 ways that it's been seen.
Okay, and finally, let's move on to the question. I mean, we've talked about the different recitations. One thing we haven't spoken about is, and the book discusses this, is the history of Quranic manuscripts. What are the earliest manuscripts that we do have? What are the oldest Qur'ans that...
Yeah, so the manuscripts is a fascinating aspect, and there's a few chapters in this book about that. So funnily enough, we actually have a lot of very early manuscripts that have been preserved, and there's been a lot of work done on it. So first of all, a lot of these manuscripts were found in depositories in the various parts of the Muslim world, especially in the 1900s. So places like Damascus, the Qarawiyyin, Fustat, Sana'a. In fact, in the National Library in France, there's 250 copies or folios of the Qur'an that was found in Masjid Amr ibn al-As in Fustat. And there's hundreds of leaves, and there's a lot of work that's been done in trying to date these manuscripts. And when we talk about dating, there's 2 ways. You have paleography, which is the study of handwriting, and you have carbon-14 dating. So initially, there was a lot of kind of studies with paleography in order to date these manuscripts. So people would... So to give an example, in the Fihris of Ibn al-Nadim, he mentions that the first style of writing the Qur'an was the Meccan script, and then he describes how the Meccan script looked like. And the Meccan script, he basically states, turned slightly to the right, the strokes were lengthened, there was a slight slant to it. That is very kind of similar and accurate to the folios that were found in Amr ibn al-As mosque. Maybe we can put it up, we can have a look on the screen, but So scholars have said this is like maybe the Hijazi script. And so that was one way through paleography. But I would say the most kind of the prominent way now is carbon-14 dating. So carbon-14 dating is more of a scientific way of dating organic material. So the way carbon-14 dating works is that all organic things like plants and animals and human beings have a level of carbon-14 in them when they're alive. But when you die, that doesn't get replenished. And so scientists can calculate when an organic material dies about how old that thing is. Now, the earliest manuscripts, they were written on parchments, which is like sheepskin and things like this. So if we have these early manuscripts, like the one that were found in Fustat, like in Amr ibn al-As mosque, and you send it to a laboratory, you can actually measure how old these manuscripts are. And this has been done with some of the earliest manuscripts, and we have all sorts of dates, but we can quite confidently say that the earliest manuscripts are certainly from the time of the Umayyad period. So around just 20 to 50 years after the death of the Prophet. It depends. So this is the thing with carbon-14 dating. It gives you a range. It doesn't give you a date. It gives you a range of dates. So the date when that animal died, it falls between that range. And so the range is between things like 606 to 675, but very, very early.
So that would actually place it potentially at the lifetime of the Prophet or just after?
Well, yes. Yeah, and I think there's a big thing about the Birmingham manuscripts. Yeah. So here's the thing we need to bear in mind. The carbon-14 dating can only kind of say when the material, like the animal died or something, right? That doesn't mean it was written then. Someone could have that parchment and kept it and then wrote it afterwards. and this actually links to the Sana'a manuscripts. I think this is something to just quickly talk about.
Just quickly, is the Sana'a manuscript seen as older than the Birmingham manuscript, or is the Birmingham one the oldest?
So when the Birmingham one was dated, it was dated as being older, and that's what caused a lot of kind of excitement and things like this. But I think I would probably say the Sana'a manuscripts are probably the oldest. And let me explain why. Okay, so here's what we need to understand about the Sana'a manuscripts. The Sana'a manuscripts are not one reading of the Qur'an, there are two. The Sana'a manuscripts are... So what happened was, in 1972, there was some renovation that happened in the Grand Mosque of Sana'a, and a stack of materials, parchments were found. And then there were scholars that looked at these parchments, and they found that these were very old copies of the Qur'an. That in itself isn't significant because we have it in other regions of the Muslim world. What was significant was that there were two layers. There was an underlayer which had been rubbed out, and after that had been rubbed out, an upper layer was then written over it. So there's a bottom layer of the Qur'an, and then there's an upper layer of the Qur'an. And the visible thing that you can see with the naked eye is the upper layer. But through things like using ultraviolet light, imaging processing, you can actually decipher what the bottom layer is. And that bottom layer is really kind of fascinating because, so the Sana'a manuscripts contain 40% of the Qur'an. And the reason why it's important is because every single manuscript that we have, we were talking about the Uthmanic Codex, right? Mm-hmm. Every single manuscript that we have...
Right, is it this?
This is the thing. So every manuscript that we have in existence, bar none, follows this Uthmanic archetype, except for the bottom layer of the Sana'a manuscript. Yeah, so there are orthography in the bottom layer of the Sana'a manuscript that is not in accord with every other manuscript, which makes it so fascinating.
So, I mean, that almost follows that kind of traditional narrative to a T.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, absolutely.
The other kind of versions were destroyed.
Destroyed.
Or in this instance, maybe written over.
Written over, yeah. I mean, so it's known as a palimpsest. It's not unusual because parchment's very expensive. So you can imagine the effort that's involved in making a parchment, and why would you just discard it? So you can rub everything out and just rewrite on top of it.
I appreciate the paper that you have today.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one, and some say it could be the codices. And by the way, the lower text of the Sana'a manuscripts is in accord with what classical narrations say was the reading of people like Ibn Mas'ud. So just to give you an example, right? In Surah Yusuf, وَقَالَ نِسْوَةٌ فِي الْمَدِينَةِ. In the lower text of the Sana'a manuscript, there's an addition of min ahl. So instead of niswatun fil Medina, it's niswatun min ahlil Medina. Now that min ahl is not going to be accommodated in an Uthmanic orthography because that's an entire word that's been added. It's not just dots, it's an actual word. Other examples could be things that might not be there. So for example, قال ربي إني وحن العظم مني واشتعل الرأس شيبة. In the Sana'a undertext, it's وقال رب اشتعل الرأس شيبة. So there's something missing there. إنا منتظرون. There's an additional in the undertext. إنا معكم منتظرون. Or there's other ones like instead of من بعد ما جاءتكم البينات, in the Sana'a underlayer it's من بعد ما جاءتكم الهدى. So these are quite significant different words, and some of these actually do coincidize with what the traditional narratives say were the codices of. But the thing is, this is with the past. We don't 100% know. We can only try our best to try and reconstruct what we can.
And this is again, the book looks at this.
Yeah. So there's chapters in that. The first two chapters go into a lot of detail with some really great scholars that look into this as well.
I better get commissioned with the amount I've been plugging the book. All right, okay. Final question then to wrap up. And for those that have stuck with us, well done for that. How do we understand this question regarding the Quran's preservation in history from a theological angle? Well, because we've talked about these things historically, but in the realm of theology, and again, I don't know how comfortable or how much you want to get into kind of theological debates regarding the Quran's preservation, the Quran being the divine word. Yeah. I mean, how do we understand that question of singularity and preservation, and then this, I mean, what the evidence seems to demonstrate, variation and difference.
Multiplicity.
Multiplicity.
Well, so the first thing I would say, it's not controversial because this is what our scholars of the past have said very openly. There's such, and I think maybe the issue comes is people aren't aware of the history.
Right.
And so and this is why I gave that example of many years ago when that Qari from Egypt was reciting and people got really angry. Like, how can you recite? Because people weren't aware. But if you will go to a scholar of qira'at, or even anybody who studies the history of the Qur'an, they would be like, yeah, this is in the sources. So the first thing I would say, it's never been seen as something controversial. This is something that's been accepted within it. But what I will say is that all the stages that I've spoken about, in all of the different stages, I think what's quite remarkable, like Uthman, with Uthman's codification, he restricts it very successfully. Like, he very successful. Like, any other alternates are burnt, and that does become the reading that everybody ends up adopting.
Yeah, as you mentioned, that is
the reading. Yeah. And when we refer to the Mus'haf, we say to the Uthmanic Mus'haf. And then in the next stage, Ibn Mujahid comes along, and again he does it very successfully. There were 50 or however many eponymous readers. He does it quite successfully. He adopts 7, and then obviously another 3 is added. But then even the Rawis again. So the Rawis, instead of like 9 for Hafs, there's 2, and that again is accepted by the majority of the Muslim world. So at each stage, and then even up to 1924. Again, another successful kind of way that the Qur'an, everybody just, almost like an ijma', everyone just kind of accepts it. And the reason I say this is quite remarkable is because, look, Muslims disagree on theology. They disagree on fiqh, on Islamic law, on the way people interpret. Civil wars. The whole history of Islamic history is full of civil wars. But in a kind of a remarkable way, nobody's really disagreeing with the Qur'an. Like, nobody's saying, oh, that shouldn't have happened. That, like, eventually through history it becomes accepted of what, and so, because in history normally what happens is, from one point of singularity you end up with multitudes, and it just expands and it expands and it expands. Whereas in the Qur'anic context, it kind of goes the other way. From multiplicity to every stage, it becomes more restricted, and that's done successfully by. So maybe that's one way one could see, if one wanted to see it theologically, in terms of the Qur'an's preservation. I mean, I'll just finish off with one more example, just to show how successfully this worked. There's a very famous detractor in the sources, anybody who studies the history of the Qur'an, by the name of Ibn Shanabudh. And Ibn Shanabudh is seen as this pariah figure. And the reason why he's so controversial is because he champions his own reading of the Qur'an at the time of Ibn Mujahid. And he says, oh, this is the reading that comes from Ubay bin Ka'ab. This is the reading that comes from Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. But this is where it gets a bit controversial, because Ibn Shanabudh's reading was not in accord with the Uthmanic Rasam. And so he is really he's tortured. He's he's seen as a very, a negative figure. But what's interesting is, because he goes against the ijma', he's kind of discarded. Like, his reading is not accepted at all. But in an almost ironic sense, when you talk about like Ibn al-Jazari, for example, Ibn Shanabudh is a canonical tariq for the reading of Qunbul from Ibn Kathir. So he's accepted in that sense because he's in accord with what becomes accepted. But because he's not in accord with the ijma', he's kind of disregarded in that sense. So this is the kind of thing that you see happening, and there's this process of that restriction, and slowly from multiplicity, it's coming to that a more kind of agreed upon ijma', which stands to this day, which is the fact that, I mean, it's remarkable that 95% of the world recite in Hafs and Asim. Like, that's...
Well, let me ask you just a final question then to wrap up. I mean, we've spoken about all these differences, and if you were not familiar, you might think that these differences were huge differences. But I mean, maybe you can finish off on this. I mean, we're not, just to clarify here, we don't find Qur'ans with different surahs, for example.
Exactly, yeah.
We're talking about perhaps a singular word here, a pronunciation there.
Absolutely.
And so I don't know if you could quantify it, but for the vast majority of the text arguably has been preserved. I mean,
I think that's an important question. I think that's a really important question, because all of these different stages, relatively speaking, it is quite inconsequential. Like, okay, pronunciation, at a hermeneutical level, even if you take, even for the sake of argument, you take the readings of Ibn Masud, which are the biggest ones, they don't change really hermeneutically the message or meaning of the Quran. These are very slight things. And so that's something I think an important point to bear in mind. Even though we are talking about variances and difference, these are not huge differences. And especially after Ibn Mujahid, these are like really like pronunciation or like really minor things in the grand scheme of things. So that is something I think is important to bear in mind.